Hi everyone, welcome to Synthesizing Appalachian Protest Music. This presentation combines our focus on feminist activism this week with a strategic tool for organizing your research called the Synthesis Matrix. This presentation will examine the role of protest music in social justice initiatives and will provide a strategy for organizing research before drafting your essay. By the end of the video, you should be able to consider how primary texts, such as musical performance, photograph, interviews, personal narratives, convey meaning as part of a feminist research methodology, to analyze examples of Appalachian protest music through a WGS lens, to identify and evaluate thematic patterns or observations or concepts between texts, specifically musical performances, and to synthesize concepts and source textual evidence into a synthesis matrix or an organizational tool for research. To begin this process, let's listen to 4 examples of Appalachian protest music together. This first song is by Kathy Fink and it's called Coal Mining Woman. Coal mines are at the roots of Appalachian protest music. There are songs about strikes, black lung, and the struggles of working women. This was originally sung by Hazel Dickens. In this feminist manifesto, Fink reminds us, you can't own your life if you can't pay your bills. You may need to right-click on the link and listen to this outside of the PowerPoint, even though the video is embedded in the PowerPoint. Take a moment and think about some of the observations that you had when you listened to Coal Mining Woman. I've written a few of mine here. Let's move on to the next musical selection. Sam Gleaves sings Ain't We Brothers. In his rootsy vocals, he tells the story of a gay West Virginia coal miner named Sam Palms who faced extensive backlash in his community. The coal miner asked the people who judged him, beat him up, and shamed him, "Ain't we brothers?" while taking the coal companies to court for discrimination. Take a moment and listen to this selection. Like we did with the first piece, think about some of your observations. Some of the themes, some of the refrains, some of the points that Sam Gleaves makes in his performance. I've written a few of mine here. Our third selection is from the Real World String Band, and it's Who Owns Appalachia? Traditional and old-time musicians, the Real World String Band, dedicated 40 years to cultural and feminist activism supporting social movements in Kentucky and the Appalachian region. In the version that I showed of this last year, Paula Nelson, a Cherokee poet, introduces the piece. Unfortunately, this version is no longer available online. I also thought you might find it interesting to read more about Sue Massick's oral history, which is housed in the Radford University repository, and there's a link here at the bottom of the screen. Take a moment and listen to this third selection. Like we did with the first 3, jot a few notes down about the piece, some observations that you had, some quotes that stuck out to you, something perhaps about the way it was performed. I've written a few of my thoughts here. Finally, let's listen to West Virginia Water, which is a hip-hop piece about the 2014 chemical spill from an industrial chemical in the coal mine manufacturing process that leaked into the Elk River. This left about 300,000 residents temporarily without water, and you probably remember this news story. Take a moment and listen to this piece. Here are some of my notes from the song that we just listened to. How do they compare with your thoughts and observations about the piece? So what I want to do now is start thinking about these 4 examples of Appalachian protest music together. What kinds of messages do they have in common? How do they diverge from one another? And if we were going to write an essay about our observations about these pieces, what would that look like? So let's begin by talking about a synthesis matrix. What is a synthesis matrix? When using multiple sources to research a topic, our notes sometimes become unwieldy. We want to demonstrate that we have consulted several sources, but at the same time, there are a variety of perspectives on the same topic. When this confusion happens, writers negotiate multiple claims through specific tools that organize researched information to visualize relationships between sources' points of view and to construct an argument that integrates both the source's evidence and the writer's voice. Examples of tools for organizing and managing research you may use include a web, a timeline, or an outline. And there are benefits and limitations to all of these methods. For instance, a web creates a map-like visual that connects source ideas, but might not be linear enough to organize these connections in order to construct an argument. An outline provides a linear organization that's lacking in a web, but may not enable the writer to easily see source connections. A timeline arranges sources chronologically, but does not address how other relationships between sources work or does not explicate how specific evidence supports those relationships. In fact, it might be helpful to use a combination of these tools for a research essay. Another possible tool for visualizing and organizing connections between sources is the synthesis matrix. This is a graphic organizer that provides a visualization of research so that you're able to see what you already have, what you might eliminate, and what you still need for your project. Visually, it's a chart with rows and columns that identifies and connects sources to one another. In terms of organization, it compiles all of your sources' arguments and evidence which support those arguments into one location. Think of it as a tool that you could use to build your researched essay. Here's an example of a synthesis matrix that we might put together for our Appalachian protest music examples. It begins as a blank grid. The number of columns depends on how many sources you're working with, and the number of rows depends on how many connections you discover between your sources. Next, you'll determine how many sources you plan to include in your project, and you'll create columns for these sources, as I have done here. If, for example, you have 5 sources, you would construct a table with 6 columns. The first column remains blank, and we'll talk about that in a second. Label the first box in each column with either the source's name, the author's name, or the website so you can easily identify it. I've labeled it with each of the 4 songs that we listened to here, but if you were going to do this for your researched essay, then you would have 5 columns, so you would add one more column to the right here, and you would label it with the author's last name from the source that you're reading from and taking notes from. Now we're going to spend a moment talking about this far left-hand column that I mentioned, the common concepts, or you could think of it as patterns or themes between the sources that you've read, or in this case that we've listened to. Think about the broad connections between your sources. In order to think about sources this way, I imagine that I've invited them all to a dinner party to hang out. What would they talk about? They don't have to agree with one another, but more than one source has to be able to contribute to the conversation. So for example, you would not want to have a topic under the common concepts column that only one source can talk about for the most part. Sometimes that works, but usually you want to have more than one source talking to each other. Under the appropriate source and concept, then you'll add examples using quotes and paraphrase statements. Do you remember the notes that we took after each piece a moment ago? Those notes I've organized now into this grid. For instance, I came up with these common concepts that I noticed between all 4 musical selections, and then I wrote notes Notice that some of the boxes are empty, and that's okay. Also, notice that some of the rows have much more information than others, and that's also all right. Not every source will speak to every concept. Also, there may be overlaps where a quote or paraphrase fits into one or more of these conceptual connections. And as a researcher and writer, you'll need to determine the best fit for your evidence. Finally, you may need to increase or decrease columns and rows based on your project's needs. So this is a fluid document. Your synthesis matrix will help you write your first draft. In fact, students often tell me that this and the research journals are two tools which they carry through into other classes where they have to write research papers in the future. If you look at your research journals, the notes that you took in those journals can go underneath these headings here, just as I've done with taking my notes from the videos. Also, each of the concepts can become a section of your essay's argument. I think of each one of these rows as either one or two body paragraphs in my researched essay. For instance, I've identified this one row here with the blue highlight because it was something that really interested me and something I didn't think about before I started putting this video together. Who gets to tell the story? So this focuses on our conversation about narrative and discourse from a previous chapter. And so I started thinking about, okay, in Coal Mining Woman, Fink speaks from or sings from the coal mining woman's perspective. In Ain't We Brothers, Gleaves sings the story of the man who protested against and went to court against discrimination. In Who Owns Appalachia, even though the initial version that I used to play of this begins with the voice of a Cherokee poet, it does not include it. And then in the final piece, there's a lot of conversation about media portrayals of the region. There's the quote about on the news, West Virginia is voted most miserable, most abused. The images in the video juxtapose the natural, the industrial, and the urban landscapes in West Virginia. And then there's, again, this quote, they don't know how it feels to lay your head in these fields. There's this resistance against narrative stereotypes in the media about the Appalachian region, specifically in West Virginia. So this I would create into a body paragraph with an argumentative topic sentence, and then each one of these quotes or paraphrase points from these sources I would use as evidence to support my argumentative paragraph. There's a handout that follows this video that breaks down the structure of an argumentative paragraph to help you link this further, but I hope that you will use this tool to help you organize your source evidence into an argument for your researched essay. Like your research question, the synthesis matrix will change as your research and writing process evolves with the project, helping you to organize and categorize additional research.